10,000 years ago, humanity made the worst deal in its history. We gave up freedom for bread. For 300,000 years, Homo sapiens roamed the earth as hunter-gatherers. We ate over 100 different species of plants and animals. We worked 4 to 5 hours a day. We had no kings, no taxes, no armies, no famines. Skeletons from that period show people who were taller, healthier, and had stronger bones and teeth than the farmers who came after them. Then wheat arrived, and everything changed. Within a few generations, the same humans who had lived in small, mobile bands were now tied to fields, working from sunrise to sunset, eating primarily one crop, storing grain in warehouses controlled by priests and rulers who had never existed before, dying younger, shorter, sicker. The historian Yuval Harari called the agricultural revolution history's biggest fraud, not because it was bad for wheat. Wheat went from a wild grass growing in a small patch of the Middle East to the most widely cultivated plant on Earth, covering more than 200 million hectares across every continent except Antarctica. Wheat won. Humanity lost. What if wheat had never existed, not just as a food, as the trap that built civilization and everything that came with it, the cities, the armies, the empires, the inequality, the famines, and the wars that defined 10,000 years of human history. The grass that trapped humanity. This is not the story you were taught in school. In school, the agricultural revolution is progress. Humans discovered farming, stopped wandering, built cities, invented writing, created civilization. A straight line from caves to skyscrapers, each step an improvement on the last. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. When scientists examine the skeletal remains of people from the transition period, the generations that lived through the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, what they find is not progress. They find deterioration. The first farmers were on average 3 to 4 inches shorter than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Their bones show higher rates of arthritis from the repetitive physical labor of farming. Their teeth show severe decay and enamel defects, the result of a diet dominated by starchy grains. Their remains show signs of iron deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, and childhood malnutrition at rates far higher than the people who came before them. Hunter-gatherers were not, as the old story suggested, constantly on the edge of starvation. Studies of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the 20th century, the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, show that they typically worked between 3 and 5 hours a day to meet their nutritional needs. The rest was leisure, socializing, ceremony, rest. Their diets were extraordinarily varied. Dozens of different plant species, multiple animal sources, seasonal abundance and adjustment. The first farmers worked harder, ate worse, and died younger. They did it not because farming was a better life, but because it could support more people per square kilometer than hunting and gathering. More people living worse in the same space. This is what the agricultural revolution actually produced. So why did it happen? Why would anyone choose this? Most anthropologists now believe they didn't choose it. The transition to agriculture was gradual, spanning centuries, driven by climate change and population pressure, rather than deliberate decision. People didn't wake up one day and decide to become farmers. They drifted into dependence on cultivated plants over generations, by which point there was no going back. The population had grown too large to sustain itself on wild food. The trap had closed. The place where the trap first closed has been identified with some precision. The Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from what is now Israel and Jordan, through Lebanon, Syria, southern Turkey, and into Iraq and Iran, is where wild wheat and barley grew naturally in dense enough stands that early humans could harvest them efficiently. The Natufian culture, which flourished in this region between 15,000 and 11,500 years ago, was the bridge. The Natufians were semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who began to harvest wild grains with stone sickles. They built permanent stone structures. They stored grain in pits. They were not yet farmers, but they were becoming dependent on grain before they had learned to grow it. When the climate shifted dramatically around 12,000 years ago, a cold, dry period called the Younger Dryas that lasted for over 1,000 years, wild plant food became scarcer. The Natufians, already dependent on grain, had two choices: move or plant. Many of them planted. The agricultural revolution began not as an inspired leap forward, but as a desperate adaptation to changing conditions by people who had already given up enough of their mobility that walking away was no longer an option. And wheat, of all the plants that humanity experimented with in those early millennia, turned out to be the perfect trap. How wheat built power. Wheat did something that almost no other food crop could do. It could be stored. This seems like a minor detail. It wasn't. It was the hinge on which all of human history turned. A society that lives on fresh fruit, game meat, and wild plants has no surplus. You eat what you find. You find what's available. When times are lean, everyone suffers equally. When times are good, everyone benefits equally. There is no mechanism for one person to accumulate more than another. Not because ancient hunter-gatherers were morally superior to us, but because the nature of their food supply made permanent accumulation impossible. Grain changes everything. Wheat harvested in summer can be stored in sealed containers and eaten in winter. In a good year, more wheat can be grown than is needed immediately. That surplus can be held in a granary, and whoever controls the granary controls the people who depend on it. This is where kings come from. The earliest writing in human history, Sumerian clay tablets from around 3200 BC, is not poetry or philosophy or religious revelation. It is accounting. Lists of grain quantities, records of who deposited how much wheat, who withdrew how much barley, who owed what to whom. The first use of written language was to track control of grain surpluses. The first states in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in early China, were built on grain taxation. Farmers grew wheat. A portion was taken by the state, by rulers, priests, soldiers, in exchange for protection, religious services, and the maintenance of order. The farmer fed the soldier. The soldier protected the farmer. the ruler sat above both, controlling the granaries that made the entire system possible. Egypt understood this more completely than any civilization before or since. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was the supreme administrator of the Nile flood cycle that made wheat agriculture possible, and therefore the supreme controller of the grain surpluses that the flood produced. The state granaries of ancient Egypt were the most sophisticated food storage and distribution system the ancient world had ever seen. Grain was collected as tax, stored in royal warehouses, distributed to workers building the pyramids, released to prevent famine in bad harvest years. The pharaoh's power was inseparable from his control of grain. The story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, sold into slavery in Egypt, rising to become the administrator who saved the country from famine by storing grain during 7 years of abundance for 7 years of scarcity, is the first recorded case study in strategic grain reserve management. Whether it is literally true or not, it captures something real about how the ancient world worked. The person who controlled the grain supply controlled the future. This was not a contract. It was a structure that emerged from the nature of storable grain. You cannot tax a nomad. You cannot control a population that can simply walk away from you. But a farmer who has cleared a field, planted a crop, and invested a season's labor in a piece of land is immovable. He will be there at harvest time, and at harvest time, the tax collector will also be there. Wheat made settled populations. Settled populations made taxation possible. Taxation made states. States made armies. Armies made empires. And empires made the world we live in. The famines wheat made possible. Here is the paradox at the heart of wheat's history. The crop that fed civilization also created the famines that periodically destroyed it. Hunter-gatherers did not experience famine in the way agricultural societies did. Their food supply was diverse. If one species failed, others remained. Their mobility allowed them to follow abundance. Large-scale, catastrophic food failures, the kind that killed hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of months, were essentially impossible in a society that ate from 100 different sources and could move to find them. Agriculture created the monoculture. When an entire region planted wheat and the wheat failed, everyone starved together. The infrastructure of civilization, the roads, the cities, the irrigation systems, the tax bureaucracy, all of it had been built on the assumption that grain would come. When it didn't, the entire structure could collapse. The great famines of history are almost all grain famines. The famine that contributed to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. The repeated famines that swept medieval Europe when wheat harvests failed. In 1315, unseasonably cold and wet summers destroyed wheat harvests across northern Europe for 2 consecutive years. The Great Famine that followed killed between 10 and 25% of the population of some regions. People ate cats, dogs, and in documented cases, the bodies of the dead. A civilization that had taken centuries to build lost 1/4 of its people in 2 years because one crop failed. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which 3 million people died when rice and wheat supplies were disrupted by war and colonial mismanagement. The Chinese famines of the Great Leap Forward, 1959 to 1961, when the forced collectivization of grain agriculture killed between 15 and 55 million people, the deadliest famine in human history. And the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, in which Joseph Stalin deliberately engineered a catastrophe by confiscating grain harvests and blocking food imports to a region that had resisted Soviet collectivization. Between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians died. The grain that Ukraine had grown was exported to fund Soviet industrialization, while its farmers starved. Every single one of these catastrophes was made possible by the same thing: a population that had become entirely dependent on cultivated grain, with no alternative food source, no mobility, and no ability to survive when the harvest failed. The crop that fed billions also made those billions vulnerable in a way that no hunter-gatherer had ever been. Wheat and war control grain, control people. Control people, build armies. Build armies, conquer grain. This circular logic drove the expansion of every major empire in the ancient and medieval world. Rome at its height required approximately 300,000 tons of grain per year to feed its capital city alone. That grain came from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily, provinces conquered and held specifically because they could produce wheat at scale. The Roman grain supply was a strategic asset as critical as its legions. When the grain supply was threatened, the empire mobilized as if facing military attack. Because it was. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, was coined to describe the Roman government's policy of keeping the urban poor pacified with free grain distributions and public entertainment. Free grain, not as charity, but as political management. The emperors understood that a hungry Roman mob was an existential threat. The grain dole was a tool of social control at urban scale. Medieval European kings fought wars over grain-producing territories with the same ferocity they fought over gold mines. The 100 Years' War between England and France was partly a war over control of the grain-rich regions of northern France, Normandy, the Loire Valley, Burgundy, regions that could feed armies and generate tax revenue simultaneously. Control the wheat fields, control the war. In the First World War, wheat became a weapon in ways that reshaped the entire conflict. Britain imposed a naval blockade on Germany that cut off imports of wheat and other foodstuffs from the Americas and the rest of the world. Germany had been dependent on imported grain to feed its urban population and its army. As the blockade tightened, food supplies inside Germany deteriorated catastrophically. By 1917, the German civilian population was subsisting on what became known as the turnip winter, root vegetables substituted for the wheat bread that had disappeared from German tables. Civilian morale collapsed, strikes erupted, The social fabric that had sustained the German war effort began to unravel. Military historians have debated endlessly what won the First World War. The answer, in significant part, is wheat. Britain controlled the sea lanes. Britain, therefore, controlled the wheat supply. Germany's armies in the field were never decisively defeated. They were fighting effectively until the armistice. But the civilian population behind the lines was starving. The German government signed an armistice in November 1918, not because it had run out of soldiers, but because it had run out of bread. Grain as weapon, grain as currency, grain as political instrument. 10,000 years, the same story. The wheat we eat today. Today, wheat is the most widely grown crop on Earth. Approximately 780 million metric tons are produced annually on more than 200 million hectares of farmland across every inhabited continent. It provides approximately 20% of all calories and protein consumed by the human species. There is no food crop more important to human survival. And it is changing in ways that most people don't understand. The wheat grown today is not the wheat that built ancient civilizations. The Green Revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, led by the American agronomist Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work, produced new, high-yield, dwarf wheat varieties that transformed global food production. These varieties could produce 2 to 3 times as much grain per hectare as traditional varieties. They enabled India and Pakistan and Mexico to feed rapidly growing populations that older agricultural methods could not have sustained. They are estimated to have saved over 1 billion lives. They also transformed the wheat plant itself. Modern wheat is shorter, with a larger seed head and a weaker root system. It requires more fertilizer, more water, and more pesticide than traditional varieties. It is extraordinarily productive under ideal conditions and extraordinarily vulnerable when those conditions change. Most of the genetic diversity that existed in wheat 10,000 years ago has been lost, replaced by a handful of high-yield varieties that dominate global production. In Turkey, in the region where wheat was first domesticated, researchers have found wild relatives of wheat that carry genetic material no longer present in any commercially grown variety. Resistances to diseases, adaptations to drought, nutritional profiles that commercial wheat has lost. These wild relatives grow in patches on hillsides that are being converted to agriculture. When those patches disappear, those genes disappear with them. We are, once again, narrowing the genetic base of our most important food crop. We have been here before, with the potato, with the banana. The lesson has not been learned. Finale. A world without wheat, no agricultural revolution, or an agricultural revolution that came differently, later, built on different crops. No grain surpluses, no granaries, no kings or priests to control them, no taxation, no standing armies, no empires, no cities on the scale that wheat made possible, no writing. The first writing was grain accounting. No civilization as we understand the word. And also, no famines on the scale that wheat made possible. No Holodomor, no Bengal famine, no great leap forward, no bread and circuses, no grain wars, no British naval blockades starving Germany into armistice, no empires built and maintained through control of food supplies. One wild grass, growing in a small patch of what is now southeastern Turkey, 10,000 years ago. Here is the question the history of wheat actually asks. We call what happened a revolution. We call it progress. We call it the foundation of civilization. All of those things are true. And so is something else. It was a trap that closed so slowly that no one felt it closing. The humans who made the transition from foraging to farming did not know what they were giving up. By the time they might have understood, there was no going back. We are still in that trap. The cities, the institutions, the 7 billion people who cannot be fed any other way, all of it rests on cultivated grain, on wheat. The question is not whether the trap was a good thing or a bad thing. The question is whether we know we're in it, and what we plan to do about the next one.